Today, we'll be talking about the impact of something that we discussed in our last lesson, and that is the fact that Europeans are kidnapping and purchasing people from all along the western coast of Africa. And these people speak different languages, worship different gods, have different cultures, like different things. And so, what happens when you throw them all together into the new world? Well, the answer in the short and long term is the development of African American culture. Then we'll also talk about why local African rulers decide to trade with Europeans, even though it means providing them with slaves, and what they get out of the deal as well. I'm also going to begin with a semi apology. So I'm going to apologize for not putting anything excessively goofy in the presentation for today. And of course, I didn't do that in the last presentation either. Now, the reason isn't because I've suddenly become, lame over the snow break, though that's always, I guess, a possibility. The actual reason is this. There are some things in history that you just don't joke about, and the Atlantic slave trade and anything related to it, that's just one of those things. And to give you kind of an idea of why we don't do that, I got an email from a student yesterday asking the following question. And the question was, with 12 million people affected by the African diaspora, where, again, up to 12 million people are forcibly kidnapped from their homes and sent to the New World, where the vast majority of them will end up dying due to working conditions, disease, malnutrition, or just summary execution. The question is this the worst genocide in human history? The answer is probably not, because if you look at the internationally agreed upon definition of genocide as defined by the United Nations after World War II, it involves acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as, and it gives an example of how genocides can be perpetrated. Genocides don't require necessarily the killing of people within that group, by the way, merely that there is an intent to deliberately harm people of a group that share certain traits in common: national, ethnical, racial, or religious. Now, you might be wondering, well, surely the purchasing of slaves, wholly black slaves from West Africa, doesn't that constitute, a targeted group? And the answer is yes. Here's the bizarre, almost trivial difference here between genocide and what happens in the slave trade: intent to destroy. So Europeans could say there was no intent to destroy because they're simply purchasing people, and they wouldn't even call them people. They're purchasing assets with the intent to use those assets. So there's not an intent to destroy. They're fundamentally, they don't care whether or not they do destroy. So this is ambivalence. And it's up to you to decide which is worse: intentionally going out of your way to kill members of a group, or not caring whether your actions do that one way or the other because you don't acknowledge the people within that group as being fully human. We don't have a word to truly describe that in the English language, either in law, in literature, in the dictionary, whatever. The ambivalent destruction of a group of people, that's not really something that we have a word that we can use to describe. So think about this. Slavery in the slave trade was so bad, it defies the infinite flexibility of the English language to adequately describe it. So, slavery is the cornerstone of an economic system that is connecting not just one, but four continents together: Europe, Africa, South America, and North America as well. And this is, of course, the Great Circuit, or it's called triangular trade. And there's an argument that basically this is what eventually replaces state-run mercantilism. It basically replaces it with more of a free market capitalist system, which is a little awkward, admittedly. So basically, the way it would work is that ships would start off in Europe and they would go to Africa carrying guns, cotton textiles, generally manufactured goods to sell at West African ports. Now, some of these ships would return to Europe again with gold and ivory, but obviously, the ones that were basically trading for slaves, they would sort of continue their journey. Most, in fact, would continue on to the Americas. But only after loading slaves on for the next part of the journey, and this is what was called the Middle Passage. Most of the slave ships, the vast majority of the slave ships, are going to places like Brazil or the Caribbean in general. And it also has to be said that if you look at revenues and in terms of what each of these major colonies produced for the mother country, these colonies were much more profitable and much more important than, let's say, colonial America, where we are. I don't feel attacked. Now, there are some ships that basically did continue on to colonial America, but it's important to note that the ships that went to colonial America are basically carrying those slaves that were sort of left over from markets in Brazil or the Caribbean. Now, once they actually got to their destination in either North or South America, they would then often take the crops harvested and cultivated by slaves and load them onto their ships. So these would be goods like sugar, tobacco, and also gold, silver, and food. Now, slavers could expect to make about 300% in profit. So that's basically 300% in overall growth. So, just for a comparison, the United States government is doing pretty good when it manages to grow by about 3 or 4% per year. 300% is mind boggling. And the only thing that it required, other than the work, was to sell off what remained of your, self respect, dignity, and of course, human decency and morality. So, generally, whenever the British want something done, they build a corporation that is essentially just supposed to do that one thing. So, for establishing colonies and trading posts in India, they create the British East India Company. For establishing banking, they create the Bank of England. So, in order to promote their role in the slave trade and to increasingly corner the market in it, because eventually the English do dominate the slave trade, they create the Royal African Company. So this creates sort of an independent source of slaves for these growing plantations in Caribbean colonies like Barbados and Jamaica, and they establish forts all along Africa to obtain these slaves. Most of these slaves are working on these massive plantations. They weren't always massive, especially if you're looking at the American South, where you had lots of sort of small landlords, small planters. You could have maybe a plantation of a few hundred acres, but if you look at the massive sugar plantations, for example, in Brazil, Barbados, Jamaica, Hispaniola, these were just these absolutely huge endeavors. So the slaves that are brought over are mostly males because it's perceived by the slave owners that only the males would be able to endure the very difficult and excruciating conditions of, working out in the sugar fields. Just to give you an idea, in places where you do see cash crops like sugar emerge, it's almost always the case that the slave population outnumbers the white population. We talked a little earlier about how slave owners themselves bizarrely felt trapped by slavery. And this is one of the reasons because, basically both sides could count. Both sides realized that the black population was larger than the white population. And the fear was that if any spark of rebellion um, occurred, then it would just lead to the massacre of the entire white population. And in fact, when we get to the early 1800s, we'll see some examples of just that happening, actually. Um, so the majority of the population in areas that grew sugar were almost always had a larger black population than white population, and even in places where sugar was not the primary cash crop, like for example South Carolina, where the primary cash crop was like rice, the black population was still about 60% of the total population. So this just kind of gives you an idea for how labor intensive some of these plantations were, especially sugar plantations. Um, in Spain and Portugal's colonies, was pretty common for slaves to also work in mines, and other slaves become household servants, and that was also common in the American South, especially later on. I'm going to push back on this point just a little bit because, yes, you do see slaves in um, a wide variety of economic fields. So, street vendors, yes, shop helpers, yes, but those were kind of exceptions that proved the rule, and that is that for the most part, the vast majority of all slaves were working out in either the sugarcane fields, the tobacco fields, eventually the cotton fields, like that's the entire reason for the system's existence. Now, when economic demand merited um, slaves working as shop helpers, for example, that could happen, but those weren't incredibly common either. Now, every slave experience is different. However, it becomes important to be able to compare those slave experiences, especially when you're looking at different experiences from across two continents, North and South America. So we've created two different categories to help understand these experiences: saltwater slaves and Creole slaves. So if you look at saltwater slaves, they generally outnumbered the white population by about 80% because these are the slaves that are either from Africa or of direct African descent that are working in those incredibly difficult sugar plantations or mining. So you're going to see these mostly in the Caribbean, Brazil, and Peru. And because the work was so draining and because living conditions were so poor, mostly the slaves in these colonies were men. If you look at the gender ratios, like the slave men versus slave women, well, slave men outnumbered slave women by about 3 or 4 to 1. But also, if you think about the living conditions in some of these colonies, they were pretty poor for almost everybody, but especially for slaves. So infant mortality was incredibly high. So it's not as if even though slavery in theory is hereditary, where the status of being a slave is passed down from parent to child, the reality is that um, the slave population had to be constantly replaced through the slave trade. So, for example, it's estimated that the average life expectancy for slaves was probably no more than 8 to 10 years after arriving. Average life expectancy was in their late 20s. Now, this is where it's important to know the difference between mean or average versus median and mode. So, not that this is going to become a math lesson, don't, hyperventilate. So, that's just the average, which means that for the vast majority of slaves, they're probably dying even earlier than those 8 to 10 years, especially before they've become accustomed to the diseases in the area. If they could make it beyond 8 to 10 years, they probably, had a fairly decent chance of living even longer. But basically, it means that the vast majority of saltwater slaves are dying within just a few years of being introduced to the New World. So now we move on to the Creole slaves. These are much more likely to be American born, and they're much more likely to have slave parents, or they have potentially been fathered by maybe a master through sexual assault and exploitation. We mentioned the consequences of that a couple of lessons back. These are more likely to be located in the American South and some parts of the Caribbean, but there is a much more even gender ratio. So tobacco plantations, for example, are not nearly as horrific as sugar plantations. And so also the climate of colonial America is less, just to put it bluntly, diseased. You don't have nearly as many tropical diseases. So I don't want to pretend that life was great. It certainly was not. But the life expectancies of slaves in colonial America was increased much more, was much greater than what you would see in, let's say, the Caribbean or Brazil, etc. So the long-term effect of this is that when the slave trade ends in the early 1800s, when the British basically declare war on the slave trade, it really doesn't do much to the slave population because, remember, slavery is hereditary. And what that means is that if you have a large enough male and female population base, then at some point that slave population becomes self-sustaining. And so on the eve of the Civil War, you have these weird situations like Virginia, where the soil had basically been depleted of the nutrients to grow tobacco, but the slave population was so large that there's what we call the internal slave trade that is established. In other words, you had some states that had their economies entirely devoted to, raising slaves and then selling them to other states in the deep South, for example, Alabama, Mississippi, so on, where the tobacco and cotton growing opportunities were much greater. If you're looking at African influences, you're going to find more in the saltwater slave population. You're going to find less if you're looking at the population of the Creole slaves. And part of that is simply that Creole slaves comprise a smaller share of the population overall than, let's say, saltwater slaves do. In Virginia, for example, it's not the case that slaves outnumber the white population by about 80%. In fact, slaves only constitute about 40% of the overall population, which is pretty significant, but still, it's not a majority, right? So they adopt more white influences, especially, by the way, European style Christianity, and we're going to see that especially in the case of, for example, the Methodist churches. I think that kind of goes a little bit beyond the time period, but by about the 1750s, you have what's called the beginning of the Great Awakening in the British colonial American colonies. And basically, that first Great Awakening converts the vast majority of African slaves to Christianity, specifically Protestant Christianity. So, slavery is based on a system of hierarchy, and so, confusingly enough, there is a hierarchy within the slave community. So, obviously, we have the saltwater slaves. There really wasn't that much hope at all for saltwater slaves, either in gaining their freedom or in, that was probably unrealistic for the vast majority of slaves anyway. But maybe you could hope to have a job that doesn't constantly try to kill you. And if you were a Creole, or even more significantly, a mulatto, you were generally given more opportunities to acquire skilled jobs, which basically means that if you have a skill-based job, you are probably going to be more necessary. Or maybe you could become a household servant, so you weren't laboring outside constantly. Mulatto, by the way, is a term that is kind of similar to mestizo. Remember, the mestizos are basically Native Americans and European mixed descent. So mulatto is basically a term that refers to mixed European and African descent. Oftentimes, mulattoes would, in fact, be the children of plantation owners themselves. So that just also kind of adds yet another wrinkle to this very, very complicated hierarchical system. Okay, so there's a couple of things here that are sort of review from other things we talked about. But first and foremost, we have um, the fact that family formation was difficult for slaves, as families may be separated at any time. That's kind of an understatement because, in fact, having families, having enslaved families was actively discouraged by planters. Because, again, remember, the goal is to basically eliminate any source of loyalty to anybody but the planters. So, again, for many African American families, fathers and mothers might actually be grandparents, they might be aunts and uncles, they might be people that have no real family tie or connection with them whatsoever. Um, Cultural syncretism is pretty common. We talked about that word before. It basically means the blending of two cultures together, two or more cultures together. The most probably the best source for that is what we already mentioned, Africans converting to Christianity. And I'll kind of come back and talk about this point specifically in just a second. And so slave hymnals become combinations of African folk songs and American Christian messages. And finally, you also have the preservation of cultural practices like voodoo that originated in the Caribbean. Voodoo is a religion that originally develops in West Africa, specifically in countries like Benin, Togo, and Nigeria. It gets exported to the New World, specifically to the island of Hispaniola, and basically its practice doesn't meaningfully differ or change much from its African roots. Now, we're going to take a closer look at African religion in the Americas. And what you're going to see again is the merging together of European Christianity, traditional African religions, and sometimes even religions like Islam were thrown into the mix. So it does note that slave conversions to Christianity were often forced by Europeans slash white Americans. I'm also going to push back against this a little bit because there are a lot of different data points to sort of, throw into the mix here. Because remember, slaves are considered chattel, they're considered personal property. So if you allow chattel to adopt Christianity, what that might signal is that which you assume doesn't have a soul might actually have one. And so for many slave owners, this sort of gets them, makes them confused. And so they just sort of actually decide not to proselytize their slaves. I think this is more so the case in like the 17th centuries. So, for example, we have records of Quaker missionaries being sent to the Caribbean to convert African slaves to Christianity. And actually, that Quaker missionary was hanged. So, in many colonial societies, it actually became like a felony to convert slaves to Christianity. But what happens is there's this thing called the First Great Awakening in the early 18th century, and slave owners kind of get swept up into the mix. And so they relax some of those rules. And so some slaves are basically allowed to adopt Christianity, some are forced to adopt Christianity. Now, what I will say is that I think that the slave owners themselves believe that they should sort of adopt all the messages that the Bible teaches about hierarchy, submission to God, thou shalt not have any other gods before me. And note the logic that's kind of being used there. It's almost as if the slave owners see themselves as like an earthly manifestation of God's authority. Sort of like a perversion of the divine right of kings to the divine right of slave owners. Of course, on the other hand, Africans have their own very different take on the Bible, and that is if you think about what is the core message in the Old Testament of the Bible, it's the book of Exodus. What is the book of Exodus about? Well, it's about a slave rebellion in which slaves led by an Egyptian prince are led out of Egypt out of the desert into the promised land. So both parties, slave owners and slaves, are interested in the Bible, are interested in biblical narratives, but both have very different takes on it. After the First Great Awakening, many Africans are able to actually organize their own churches. And for the first time, really, in their experience in colonial America, they're able to actually have an institution that is their own. So, this is something that is going to be important in the African American community, not only at this time, but going forward. Because almost all major slave rebellions or civil rights protests originally come from the African American church. Even those slave rebel leaders um, that aren't explicitly part of the church at least claim some kind of divine revelation, or they claim that they're working for God. And one of the reasons for that is that the African American church is the one place where African Americans could go and basically just be themselves at their own place of worship. So we're going to look both forwards and backwards here when we look at North American slave resistance. So on the one hand, eventually in the 19th century, which is a little bit beyond the time period, we get what's called the Underground Railroad, where slaves were allowed, or slaves escaped their plantations and moved to safe houses in either the North or to Canada, where slavery was not legal. You also have a series of slave rebellions. Um, and you have one in the Palmares. This is basically caused by a runaway. This is a runaway slave kingdom in Brazil that resisted the Portuguese and Dutch attempts to destroy it for over 100 years, which is pretty boss if you ask me. You have a slave rebellion in Suriname, where large numbers of slaves ran off in the 18th century and waged wars against their captors. And then finally, you have maroon societies, where you have communities of fugitive slaves that establish their societies of their own in hiding. Eventually, when you get to the early 19th century, you have actually pretty large slave rebellions. And these are going to be the kind of slave rebellions that produce meaningful changes, sometimes even on an apocalyptic scale. And we'll pick that story back up when we talk about the Haitian Rebellion. So I said that we were going to talk about the role that guns play in the spread of the slave trade in Africa. We're actually going to pick that up again in the next lesson because this went a little long. So until that time, I will see y'all later. Take care.